Mafia boss entered the room quietly and saw the black maid praying for his son. He couldn't speak. It was late in the afternoon when Dominic Castellano, the infamous Mafia boss, silently entered the room. The grand mansion, with its marble floors and golden chandeliers, was eerily quiet as he stepped through the heavy wooden door. His footsteps were muffled by the thick Persian rug beneath him, but the stillness of the air seemed to emphasize the tension that hung in the room. The scent of fresh roses from the vase near the window filled the space, but Dominic barely noticed. His attention was drawn to the small figure kneeling by the crib at the far side of the room. Naomi, the black maid, had been caring for his son, Marco, since the boy was an infant. A soft light filtered through the drawn curtains, casting a warm glow on Naomi as she knelt by the crib, her hands clasped tightly together in a prayerful gesture. The boy, Marco, lay peacefully in the crib, his little chest rising and falling with each breath, unaware of the moment unfolding. Naomi had always been the quiet one in the house, the one who never asked for anything, who kept to herself and did her work with a grace that was almost unnoticed. She had become the invisible part of the household, the one whose name was seldom mentioned in the conversations that filled the mansion. But in this moment, Dominic noticed her, not because of her position in the house, but because of the genuine tenderness and care she was showing his son. There was no one else in the room, just the two of them, and the calm that enveloped the space seemed almost sacred. Naomi was whispering soft words, the kind of words Dominic had never heard anyone say to his son. He watched, almost in disbelief, as she bent over the crib, her hands gently resting on Marco's tiny form. Her lips moved slowly, her words a quiet murmur, but the sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. She was praying for his son, praying for a child that wasn't even hers. A deep wave of emotion stirred within Dominic, something he hadn't expected. He had always seen himself as a man of power, a man who commanded respect and fear, someone who could manipulate any situation to his advantage. But in this moment, as he stood silently at the doorway, he felt something else entirely. His heart, usually as cold and unyielding as the marble floors beneath his feet, softened. He couldn't explain it. There was something about Naomi, the way she cared for his son without expecting anything in return, that made him feel something he had never felt before. For a moment, he stood frozen in place, unable to move, unable to speak. This was the first time he had seen someone, especially someone from such a humble background, care for his son in a way that felt so real, so pure. Naomi's prayer for Marco seemed to fill the room with a warmth he couldn't ignore. Dominic stood there, his usual confidence slipping away as he grappled with the unexpected emotions flooding his chest. He had always been the one in control, the one who made the decisions, who held the power. But in this moment, as he watched Naomi pray over his son, he felt powerless. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The Mafia boss, the feared and respected figure who ruled his world with an iron fist, was now standing before the woman who had managed to pierce the cold exterior he had built for years. And he could not speak. Dominic stood there, frozen in time, staring at Naomi as she continued to pray softly over his son. It was as if the weight of the world had lifted off his shoulders for a brief moment. The usual hardness in his eyes softened, and his mind raced with confusion and wonder. He had never seen anyone, especially someone from a position like hers, show such genuine care for his son, a child he could barely connect with. His life had been one of power and control, surrounded by people who feared him, but now he felt something unfamiliar, a sense of humility. Naomi's words were not just prayers. They were filled with hope, kindness, and a raw sincerity that Dominic couldn't ignore. He had been surrounded by opulence, violence, and manipulation all his life, but what he witnessed in that moment was something different, something pure, something that made him question the life he had built. Slowly, he stepped forward, his footsteps barely audible on the soft carpet. Naomi didn't notice him approaching. Her focus remained on Marco, her hands gently resting on the boy's head, whispering words Dominic couldn't hear. He was unsure what to do. His instincts told him to pull back, to remain the untouchable boss that everyone feared, but a new emotion stirred inside him. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. Naomi stiffened for a second, startled by the unexpected touch, But when she turned and saw Dominic standing there, her eyes widened in surprise. She immediately stood up, her body language tense, as if she had done something wrong. I'm sorry, Mr. Castellano, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to overstep my place. Dominic was still struggling to find the right words. His mouth felt dry, and his mind raced to process the scene before him. For a moment, he couldn't speak. His eyes locked with hers, searching for an explanation for the strange feelings that had emerged inside him. It was as if something had cracked open in his chest, something he had kept buried for years. No, Dominic finally said, his voice softer than usual. You didn't overstep. I've never seen you like this before. Naomi looked down, unsure how to respond. She was used to being invisible, to being the one who never drew attention to herself. But this was different. For the first time in a long while, someone had noticed her, truly noticed her. I just want to help him, Naomi replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Marco, he's such a sweet boy. I couldn't bear to see him suffer. Dominic's heart tightened at her words. He had never heard anyone speak about his son like this. Not with tenderness, not with care, not like he was something precious. For a long time, Dominic had kept himself distant from his son. He had never known how to be a father. He had built his empire on fear and control, not love. And Marco, with all his fragile innocence, was a reminder of everything Dominic had failed to protect. You care for him, Dominic said, more to himself than to Naomi. More than anyone else. Naomi hesitated for a moment before nodding. He's just a child. He deserves to feel safe, to feel loved. Her words hit Dominic harder than he expected. He had never really considered what Marco needed. His son had always been an afterthought. Something to be managed, controlled, but never truly cared for. Dominic's eyes softened, and for the first time in his life, he felt a deep sense of guilt. He had spent so much time building his empire, focusing on power and wealth, that he had neglected the one thing that truly mattered. I don't know how to be a father, Dominic admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Naomi looked at him, surprised. You don't, she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. Dominic shook his head. I've never known how to connect with him. I've always been too focused on everything else. But seeing you here, with him, I feel like I'm failing him. Naomi's heart ached at his words. She had never seen the great Dominic Castellano so vulnerable, so open. She had always known him as the powerful, untouchable figure, a man who controlled everything around him. But now, in this quiet room, she saw a side of him she never thought possible. It's not too late, Naomi said gently. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be there for him. Dominic's chest tightened at her words. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear them, how much he longed for someone to tell him it wasn't too late to make things right. For the first time in a long while, he felt hope. A hope he hadn't known existed. As he looked at Naomi, kneeling beside his son, Dominic realized that this woman, this humble maid, had given him the one thing he had been missing, compassion. He had spent his life being feared, being respected, but now, he was beginning to understand that the true power came from love and kindness. Dominic placed a hand on Naomi's shoulder once more, his voice steady but filled with gratitude. Thank you, he said quietly, for caring about him, and for caring about me. Naomi looked up at him, her expression soft. It's my job, Mr. Castellano. I only want what's best for him. Dominic nodded, feeling something shift inside him. In that moment, he knew that everything was about to change. In the days that followed Dominic's unexpected encounter with Naomi, a subtle shift occurred in the mansion. The once distant and aloof Mafia boss found himself unable to stop thinking about that moment. Naomi's gentle care for his son, Marco, had left an indelible mark on him. His mind, which had always been consumed with business deals, power struggles, and the constant need for control, was now distracted by something far more personal. His son, his role as a father, and the woman who had shown him what real compassion looked like. Naomi, for her part, continued her work quietly, as she always had. But something had changed within her as well. She noticed the subtle difference in Dominic's behavior. He no longer passed by her without a word. He would glance her way, nodding, and even speaking to her on occasion, something he had never done before. It was small, but significant. One afternoon, as Naomi was preparing Marco's lunch in the kitchen, she heard a knock at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone, and her heart raced as she opened it, unsure of what to expect. To her surprise, it was Dominic standing on the other side, his expression serious, yet softened by something she couldn't quite place. "Naomi," he said, his voice deeper than usual, "I need to speak with you. It's about Marco." Naomi's heart skipped a beat. "Of course, Mr. Castellano. What's wrong?" Dominic stepped into the room, glancing around as if searching for the right words. "There's nothing wrong with Marco," he said, his voice softening. "But I wanted to talk to you about what happened the other day. With the prayer. With him." Naomi was taken aback. She had never expected Dominic to bring it up. She had prayed for his son in the most innocent way, hoping that he would find peace, that he would be free from the suffering he had endured. I just wanted to help," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's a sweet boy, Mr. Castellano. I can't stand to see him suffer." Dominic nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he spoke again. "I know. I saw that. And it's not just about Marco. It's about me too." Naomi's brow furrowed in confusion. "You?" she asked. Dominic's eyes met hers, and for the first time, Naomi saw a vulnerability there, something raw and unguarded. "I've never been good at this," he admitted. "Fatherhood. I've been so consumed with everything else in my life. Business, power, control. I didn't know how to care for him, how to love him." Naomi's heart softened as she listened to his words. She had never imagined that the powerful, ruthless man who controlled so much of the city could feel this way. She had only ever seen him as the Mafia boss, cold, distant, untouchable. But now, in this moment, he was a man, a father, struggling with the same emotions that so many others faced. "It's not too late," Naomi said quietly. "You can still be there for him. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to show him that you care." Dominic's eyes widened slightly, as if her words had struck a chord deep within him. He had spent so much time hiding behind his own walls, focusing on his empire and his legacy, that he had never stopped to consider what truly mattered. And now, for the first time, he was beginning to understand. "I don't know where to start," he confessed. "But I want to try. I want to be a better father to him. For Marco." Naomi smiled gently, her expression full of warmth. "Start small," she advised. "It's the little things that matter. The moments when you show up for him. When you listen. When you just be there." Dominic nodded slowly, taking in her words. "I'll try," he said, his voice resolute. Naomi's heart swelled with a mixture of hope and relief. She had always believed in the power of kindness and compassion, even in the most difficult of circumstances. And now, it seemed that Dominic Castellano, the feared Mafia boss, was beginning to believe in it too. As they stood there in the quiet kitchen, an unspoken understanding passed between them. Dominic had started a journey he had never anticipated. A journey that would lead him to reevaluate everything he thought he knew about power, love, and family. He wasn't sure where it would take him, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to face it alone. Naomi had given him the courage to take the first step, and for that, he would be forever grateful. Days passed since Dominic's conversation with Naomi, and something inside him had changed. He found himself more present in Marco's life, spending time with him in a way he had never done before. Naomi's words echoed in his mind, and with each passing day, he made an effort, however small, to connect with his son. It wasn't easy. Dominic, the Mafia boss, was used to controlling every aspect of his life, his empire, his subordinates, and his own emotions. But when it came to his son, he was at a loss. The vulnerability he felt was overwhelming. Naomi had given him a glimpse of a life outside of power, one filled with simple acts of kindness and love. And for the first time, he wanted that for himself and his son. One evening, after a long day of meetings and business deals, Dominic returned home to find Marco in the living room, sitting on the floor and playing with his toys. Naomi was nearby, quietly watching over him. The moment Dominic stepped into the room, Marco looked up, his small face lighting up with a smile. "Papa," the boy called, his voice full of excitement. Dominic froze, taken aback by the sound of his son's voice. He hadn't heard Marco call him that in months, and it struck him harder than he expected. Slowly, Dominic walked over to Marco and sat down beside him. Naomi stood in the background, watching the interaction with a soft smile. She could see the subtle changes in Dominic, the way he was trying, even though he didn't always know how to express it. "How was your day?" Dominic asked, his voice rough but sincere. Marco beamed up at him, holding up a small toy car. "I made this all by myself, Papa," he said proudly. Dominic's heart swelled as he looked at his son. For the first time, he truly saw him, not just as a symbol of his legacy, but as a child who needed love and attention. "That's great, Marco," Dominic replied, his voice filled with warmth. He reached out and gently took the toy car from Marco's hand, admiring it for a moment before handing it back. "You're very talented." Marco's smile widened. "I want to show you more," he exclaimed, grabbing another toy from the floor. Dominic chuckled softly. As Marco continued to play, Dominic watched him with a sense of awe. He had spent so much of his life focused on power and control that he had never truly experienced the joy of watching his son grow and develop. This simple moment of connection, of shared joy, was something he had never known he needed. As the evening wore on, Dominic found himself staying longer than usual, engaging with Marco in ways he hadn't before. Naomi, who had been quietly watching the interaction, couldn't help but notice the change in him. It wasn't just the fact that Dominic was spending time with Marco, it was the way he was doing it, with genuine care, with an openness she had never seen in him. She had always known Dominic to be a man of few words, a man who used his power to control situations, not to connect with others. But now, she saw a side of him that was raw and real. After a while, Dominic stood up, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He had spent most of the day in meetings, dealing with the never-ending business of running his empire. But this moment with Marco had brought something different to the surface. It had reminded him of the importance of family, of love, and of being present. He turned to Naomi, who was standing quietly in the corner. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I didn't realize how much I was missing. I don't know what I would have done without you." Naomi smiled, her eyes full of understanding. "You don't have to thank me, Mr. Castellano. I'm just doing my job." Dominic shook his head. "No, Naomi. It's more than that. You've helped me see what's important. You've shown me how to be a father, not just a boss. I owe you more than you know." Naomi's heart swelled with gratitude. She had never expected anything in return for the kindness she had shown. She had simply wanted to help, to make a difference in the life of a child who needed love and care. But hearing Dominic speak those words, hearing him acknowledge the impact she had made, meant more to her than she could put into words. For the first time, Naomi felt like her work, her presence in this grand house, had a purpose beyond cleaning and taking care of the day-to-day needs of the Castellano family. As the night came to an end, Dominic stood by the window, looking out at the city below. He had built this empire with blood and sweat, but now, for the first time, he realized that true power came not from wealth or influence, but from love. He turned back to Naomi, his eyes filled with determination. "I'm going to make things right," he said. "Not just for Marco, but for all of us. I want to be the father he deserves." Naomi nodded, her heart filled with hope for the future. She had always believed that even the hardest of hearts could be softened with kindness and care. And now, as she watched Dominic, she saw that belief taking root in him. The journey had just begun, but she knew that together, they could create a better future for Marco, for themselves, and for everyone who came into their lives. Weeks had passed since Dominic made the decision to be more involved with Marco, his son. Naomi had, in many ways, become an unexpected guide to him, showing him what it meant to truly be a father. It wasn't easy. There were days when Dominic felt like an outsider in his own home, unsure of how to connect with Marco, unsure of what it meant to be a good parent. But with each passing day, he tried harder, slowly gaining ground. And Naomi, always quiet but observant, stood by him, offering small gestures of support. One afternoon, as Dominic walked through the grand halls of his mansion, he overheard Marco's laughter. It wasn't the kind of laughter he had been used to hearing. No, this was different. It was light, carefree, and filled with joy. He followed the sound of Marco's laughter, heart pounding in his chest, as he approached the family room. There, he found Marco sitting on the floor, playing with a small toy truck, completely absorbed in his own world. Naomi sat nearby, watching him with a smile. It was such a simple moment, but for Dominic, it was a revelation. He had spent so much time focused on his own needs, his empire, his reputation, that he had forgotten what it was like to experience moments of pure happiness. As he stood in the doorway, watching his son, Dominic felt a knot in his chest loosen. For the first time, he felt the weight of what he had been missing. Naomi noticed Dominic standing there, his gaze fixed on Marco. She gave him a small, understanding smile. "He's growing up, isn't he?" she said softly. Dominic nodded, his voice thick with emotion. He's different. I can see it now. He's not just a child I have to take care of. He's my son. I've been so blind." Naomi's smile grew warmer as she watched the bond between father and son begin to take shape. She had always known that Dominic had the potential to be a great father, but it was clear now that he was finally realizing it himself. "It's never too late, Mr. Castellano," Naomi said gently. "You're here now, and that's what matters." Dominic looked at her, gratitude filling his eyes. "Thank you, Naomi. You've helped me see something I've been missing for so long. I don't know what I would have done without you." Naomi felt a rush of warmth at his words. She had never expected anything in return for her kindness, but hearing him acknowledge her role in his journey meant more to her than she could express. "I'm just doing my job," she said quietly, trying to downplay the moment. But Dominic could see the sincerity in her eyes. "No," he said, shaking his head. "It's more than that. You've given me a gift I can never repay. You've shown me what really matters, and I'm not going to waste this chance." The air between them was charged with unspoken understanding, a bond that had formed quietly and without fanfare. In that moment, Dominic realized that love was not just a feeling, but an action. He had spent so many years thinking he needed to control everything, to assert his dominance. But with Marco, he had to learn to let go, to let love in. Naomi's influence had been the catalyst for this change, the gentle push that had made him realize what he had been missing. He watched as Marco stood up and ran toward him, arms outstretched. "Papa, look, I made a race track," Marco shouted, his face lighting up with excitement. Dominic knelt down, his heart swelling as he took in the sight of his son, so full of life and happiness. "That's amazing, buddy," Dominic said, his voice filled with pride. He could feel a warmth spreading through him, the warmth of being needed, the warmth of being a father. Marco grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the race track he had built. "Come play with me, Papa," he urged. Dominic looked up at Naomi, who gave him a small nod, as if to say, "It's okay. Go ahead." For the first time in his life, Dominic didn't hesitate. He stood up, took Marco's hand, and followed him over to the racetrack. As they played together, Dominic realized something profound. This moment, this simple, joyful moment with his son, was worth more than any deal he had ever made, more than all the wealth and power he had accumulated. This was what mattered. This was what he had been searching for all along. Naomi watched them, a quiet smile on her face as she observed the scene. She had known this moment would come, and now, she could see it for herself. The transformation in Dominic was undeniable. He wasn't just the Mafia boss anymore. He was a father, learning to love, to care, and to cherish the most important thing in his life. As the afternoon went on, the sounds of laughter and play filled the mansion, echoing through the halls in a way they never had before. Dominic didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. With his son, with Naomi, and with the love that was slowly but surely growing between them. He was no longer alone in his journey, and that made all the difference. As the days turned into weeks, Dominic found himself facing a new reality. His bond with Marco was growing, but so was his awareness of just how much he had missed in his life. There were moments when he would look at Marco and feel a deep sense of guilt wash over him, but at the same time, he couldn't help but feel grateful for the second chance that was slowly unfolding before him. Naomi had become an unexpected anchor in his life. She had shown him what it meant to care for someone selflessly, and her quiet strength had been the catalyst for his change. One evening, as Dominic sat at his desk in his study, the weight of his responsibilities seemed heavier than ever. He was no longer just the Mafia boss. He was a father now, and with that came an entirely different set of expectations and fears. The phone on his desk buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Naomi. "Mr. Castellano." Her voice came through the receiver, steady but filled with something he couldn't quite place. "I think you need to come to the living room. It's Marco. He's not feeling well." Dominic's heart skipped a beat. He was already on his feet before Naomi had finished speaking, his mind racing with worry. He rushed down the hallway, his footsteps quick and heavy, until he reached the living room. Marco was lying on the couch, his face pale and his body trembling slightly. Naomi was kneeling beside him, her hand resting on his forehead. "What happened?" Dominic asked, his voice thick with concern. Naomi looked up at him, her eyes filled with the kind of fear Dominic had never seen in her before. "He started complaining about feeling dizzy after dinner," Naomi explained. "At first, I thought it was just from running around earlier, but now I'm not sure." Dominic knelt beside Marco, his heart pounding. He reached out, gently brushing his son's damp hair away from his forehead. Marco's eyes fluttered open, and he looked up at his father with a weak smile. "Papa," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't feel so good." Dominic felt a wave of panic wash over him. "It's okay, buddy. We're going to get you better," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. But inside, he was anything but calm. He had spent so much of his life controlling situations, but in that moment, he felt completely powerless. Naomi's voice interrupted his thoughts. "I think we should call the doctor," she said quietly. Dominic nodded, his hand still resting on Marco's forehead. He didn't even hesitate. "I'll call the doctor," he said, his voice firm despite the knot in his stomach. As he reached for his phone, Naomi remained by Marco's side, her soothing presence a quiet comfort in the chaos of his mind. Dominic quickly dialed the number of the family doctor, giving them a brief rundown of Marco's symptoms. Within minutes, the doctor promised to come over immediately. As he hung up the phone, Dominic turned to Naomi, who was still gently stroking Marco's hair. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Naomi looked up at him, a soft smile playing on her lips. "He's just a little boy," she said quietly. "He needs you, just like he needs me." Dominic nodded, his heart swelling with both gratitude and guilt. Naomi had been right, Marco needed him. And in that moment, Dominic realized just how much he needed Marco. He had spent so much time in his life thinking he had all the answers, thinking that he could control everything. But now, sitting next to his son, he understood that the most important thing he could do was be there for him. When the doctor arrived, they quickly assessed Marco's condition, determining that he had caught a viral infection that was causing his dizziness and fatigue. The doctor reassured Dominic that it wasn't anything too serious, but that Marco would need to rest and stay hydrated. Dominic let out a sigh of relief. It wasn't serious, but still, seeing his son so vulnerable had shaken him to his core. As the doctor prepared to leave, Dominic walked him to the door. "Thank you for coming so quickly," Dominic said, his voice calm but still filled with gratitude. "Of course," the doctor replied with a nod. "Just keep an eye on him tonight. If anything changes, don't hesitate to call." After the doctor left, Dominic returned to the living room, where Marco was now resting comfortably on the couch, a blanket draped over him. Naomi sat nearby, her eyes focused on the boy, her quiet strength a steady presence. Dominic took a seat next to Marco, his gaze fixed on his son. For the first time in a long while, he felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He was going to be there for Marco, no matter what. Naomi glanced over at Dominic, a small, understanding smile crossing her face. "You're doing great," she said softly. Dominic looked at her, his heart filled with gratitude. "I never thought I could do this," he admitted. "But seeing him like this, it makes me want to try harder." Naomi's smile widened. "You don't have to be perfect, Mr. Castellano. You just have to be there." Dominic nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying. And that, he realized, was enough. The days following Marco's illness were filled with uncertainty, but also a sense of something new for Dominic. The relief that Marco was okay was followed by a deeper reflection on his own life. He had always been consumed by his empire, his power, but now, he saw the truth more clearly. There was more to life than wealth and dominance. The quiet moments with Marco had made him realize the importance of simply being present. As the weeks passed, Dominic found himself more involved in the little moments with his son. He didn't just watch from the sidelines anymore. He became a participant. He would read to Marco at night, help him with his toys, and sit beside him during meals. The bond that had been missing was slowly starting to form, and Dominic felt a deep sense of peace he hadn't known before. Naomi, of course, remained a constant presence, guiding him through this new chapter of his life. She never pushed him, but her actions spoke volumes. Her calm demeanor and unwavering care for Marco had taught him more than anyone could have imagined. One evening, as Dominic sat with Marco in the living room, the boy was showing him his toy race cars. "Papa, look, I made a race track," Marco said, his eyes shining with excitement. Dominic smiled, watching his son's joy. For the first time, he realized how much he had missed out on. As a father, he had always been distant, providing for his son financially, but never emotionally. Now, he was experiencing something far more meaningful. As they played together, Dominic felt a profound sense of love and connection. He knew this moment was special, not just because of the game, but because of the transformation he had undergone. Naomi, who had been quietly watching from a distance, noticed the change in Dominic. She had seen him struggle in the beginning, unsure of how to be the father Marco needed. But now, she could see that he was trying, really trying, to build something lasting. She smiled to herself, feeling a sense of fulfillment. She had always believed that love and care could change a person, and watching Dominic with Marco was proof of that. The doorbell rang, breaking their quiet moment. Dominic stood up, wondering who could be visiting at this hour. He opened the door to find his older brother, Vincent, standing on the other side. "Dominic, we need to talk," Vincent said, his tone serious. Dominic's stomach tightened. It was rare for Vincent to visit without a pressing matter. "Come in," Dominic replied, stepping aside to let his brother in. As Vincent entered, his gaze immediately landed on Marco, who was sitting on the floor, engrossed in his race cars. "He's getting big," Vincent commented, his voice softening as he watched Marco play. "Yeah, he is," Dominic replied, his voice filled with pride. "I've been spending more time with him." Vincent raised an eyebrow. "Really? You've changed." Dominic met his brother's gaze. "What do you mean by that?" Vincent hesitated before speaking. "I've been hearing things, Dominic. About you, about your involvement with Marco. You're not acting like the same man I've known all these years. People are talking." Dominic's face hardened. "What do they say?" Vincent's expression grew more serious. "They say you're getting soft, that you're spending too much time with your son and not enough time with business. Some of the men are starting to question your priorities." Dominic's blood began to boil. He had worked too hard to build his empire, and he wasn't about to let anyone undermine what he had built. "I don't care what they say," Dominic snapped. "I've made my choices. Marco is my priority now." Vincent looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and concern. "You can't be serious. You're the head of this family. The men respect you because you're strong. You can't let your personal life get in the way of business." Dominic's eyes narrowed. "And what would you have me do, Vincent? Spend all my time in the office, neglecting my son? I've spent too much of my life doing that already." There was a long silence between the two brothers. Finally, Vincent spoke again, his voice quieter now. "I'm just saying, Dominic, that you need to be careful. People are watching. If you show weakness, others will exploit it." Dominic's mind raced. He knew that his business was built on power, on fear, but what he had with Marco was different. It wasn't something he could throw away. "I'm not weak," Dominic said firmly. "I'm doing what's best for my family. And that includes Marco." Vincent didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at Marco again, his expression thoughtful. After a moment, he sighed and shook his head. "I hope you know what you're doing." Dominic didn't reply. He couldn't. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He was done living for everyone else. His life was no longer about being feared. It was about being present, being a father, and, for the first time, he felt like he was truly living. He turned back to Marco, who looked up at him with wide eyes. "What are we doing next, Papa?" Marco asked, his voice full of excitement. Dominic smiled, his heart full. "We're going to finish your race track, buddy," he said, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly content. Naomi watched them, her heart full of hope for the future. Dominic had come a long way, and with each passing day, she saw the changes he had made. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. The days after Vincent's visit were filled with quiet contemplation for Dominic. The tension between his two worlds, the Mafia boss and the father, had never been clearer. He had always known that his life was a balancing act, but now, for the first time, he was feeling the weight of it more than ever. His brother's words echoed in his mind. "People are watching. If you show weakness, others will exploit it." Dominic had spent his entire life building his empire on the foundation of power and fear. Now, For the first time, he questioned whether the same principles that had brought him success would be enough to hold everything together. But as he sat in the living room with Marco, watching his son's face light up with a smile, Dominic couldn't help but feel that there was something more important than all of it. One evening, after Marco had gone to bed, Dominic sat down with Naomi in the quiet of the living room. He was tired, but there was something he needed to say. "Naomi," he began, his voice quieter than usual, "I've been thinking about what Vincent said." Naomi looked at him, her expression calm. "And?" she asked softly, knowing exactly where this conversation was headed. "He's right," Dominic admitted, leaning back in his chair. "People are watching me, watching how I act, and I can't afford to show weakness. Not now, not ever." Naomi didn't immediately respond. She simply waited for him to continue. "But I can't keep living like this," he added, the frustration in his voice rising. "I can't keep pretending that my empire is everything. Marco needs me. I need him." Naomi could see the internal battle Dominic was facing. She had watched him struggle with the balance between his responsibilities as a father and as a boss, but she also saw the man he was becoming. A man who, despite his flaws, was willing to change for the better. "You don't have to choose between them, Dominic," Naomi said, her voice steady and full of conviction. "You can still be a father and a leader, but you have to make time for what matters." Dominic's eyes softened as he looked at her, as if seeing her in a new light. "I don't know how to do both. How to be both. I've always been good at controlling everything, but I can't control this." Naomi smiled gently, understanding the weight of his words. "You don't have to control it," she said. "You just have to be there. For him. For yourself. That's enough." Dominic looked at her, a small flicker of realization crossing his face. "I'm afraid, Naomi. Afraid that if I let go of control, I'll lose everything." Naomi's gaze softened, and she placed a hand on his. "You don't have to lose everything. You've already built something much more valuable than all the power and wealth in the world. You've built a family." Dominic sat in silence, letting her words sink in. The path ahead wasn't clear, but for the first time, he felt a sense of peace. He had been so focused on the fear of losing everything that he hadn't stopped to consider what he had already gained. Marco, Naomi, the moments of joy that filled his home every day. "You're right," Dominic finally said, his voice more sure than it had been in a long time. "I can do both. I will do both." Naomi smiled, the warmth in her eyes showing the quiet pride she felt in him. "I believe you." The next few weeks were filled with new beginnings for Dominic. He worked hard to find a balance, to integrate his family life with his role as a leader. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when the old ways of thinking crept in, but with each day, he became more determined. And as he spent more time with Marco, he realized just how much he had missed. One afternoon, as Dominic and Marco sat in the garden, Marco held up a picture he had drawn, his face full of excitement. "Papa, look, I made a picture of us," he said, proudly showing off the colorful drawing. Dominic smiled, feeling a deep sense of love fill his chest. "It's beautiful, Marco," he said, his voice full of warmth. "You're an artist." Marco beamed, clearly proud of his work. And, in that moment, Dominic knew that everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, had led him to this. A moment of peace. A moment of connection with his son. As the sun began to set, Dominic sat back in his chair, looking out at the sky, and for the first time in years, he felt truly content. He didn't need to control everything. He didn't need to be feared. He needed to be present. And for the first time, he realized that he had everything he truly needed right in front of him. Weeks had passed since Dominic made the decision to focus on his family. He had learned to let go of the relentless pursuit of power, and the change was undeniable. He had become the father Marco deserved, and for the first time in years, he felt content. His relationship with Naomi had deepened too. They shared a silent understanding, a bond forged in the quiet moments of caring for Marco. But the past had a way of creeping in, and Dominic knew he couldn't escape it forever. One afternoon, as he sat in his office, the phone rang, pulling him back into the world he had worked so hard to leave behind. The voice on the other end was familiar. Tony, one of his closest allies in the business. "Dominic, we need to talk. It's about the business." Dominic's stomach tightened. He had hoped to keep his focus on Marco, but he knew that the business wouldn't leave him alone. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Dominic said, his voice steady, but with a sense of reluctance. He left the office and made his way through the mansion. Marco was sitting on the floor, building with his toy blocks, completely absorbed in his own world. Dominic paused for a moment, watching him. He had promised himself that he would be there for his son, but now, he was about to walk back into the world of crime and power that had defined his life for so long. He didn't want to leave, but he knew that there were things he still had to take care of. As he walked to the door, Naomi appeared in the hallway, her eyes meeting his. "Are you going somewhere?" she asked, her voice soft but full of concern. Dominic hesitated, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. "I have to meet with Tony," he said, his voice quiet. Naomi nodded, sensing his internal struggle. "I know you have to do what you need to do, but don't forget why you're doing this," she said. Her words cut through him. She wasn't telling him what to do. She was reminding him of what mattered. Dominic looked at her for a moment, his eyes full of appreciation. "I won't forget," he said, though the uncertainty lingered. He stepped out of the door and into the night, his mind clouded with conflicting emotions. He arrived at the small office where Tony and a few other men waited. The room was dimly lit, filled with the heavy scent of cigars and stale air. Tony stood up as he entered, his expression serious. "You're late," Tony said, his tone sharp. "I had things to take care of," Dominic replied, taking a seat at the table. "Let's get to the point." Tony didn't waste any time. "We have a problem, Dominic. The business is starting to slip. There are people within the organization questioning your priorities. They're seeing you spend less time in the field and more time with your son." Dominic's jaw tightened. He had known this moment would come, but hearing it out loud was different. "I'm still in charge," he said, his voice cold. "But the business is more than just about control. It's about keeping our family secure. You're losing focus." Tony's words stung. Dominic had spent his entire life focused on keeping his empire intact, but now, things were different. He wasn't sure if he could balance both his family and his business the way he once did. He had tried to change, to focus on Marco, but his responsibilities as the head of the Castellano family weren't so easily shaken. "I'll handle it," Dominic said, standing up. "But I'll do it my way. You'll do what needs to be done, but I won't sacrifice my son for this." Tony's expression softened for a brief moment. "I understand, but you need to remember who put you in charge of all this. If you let go, others will take what's yours." Dominic met Tony's gaze with a quiet strength. "I know what I'm doing. I'm not letting go of anything, but I'm not going to let this destroy me either." The conversation ended abruptly, leaving Dominic feeling as if a heavy weight had settled on his chest. As he made his way back to the mansion, his thoughts raced. He had promised himself that Marco would always come first, but now, he was being pulled back into the world he had tried so hard to escape. The door to the mansion creaked open, and Dominic stepped inside. The sound of laughter echoed from the living room. Marco was sitting on the floor, surrounded by his toys, while Naomi watched him from the couch. Dominic felt a wave of relief wash over him. This was what he had fought for. This was what he wanted. He walked over to Marco, who looked up and smiled at him. "Papa," Marco said excitedly. "I made a new race track." Dominic knelt down, feeling the warmth in his chest. He was still a father. No matter what happened, that would never change. "That's amazing, buddy," Dominic said, his voice filled with pride. He could feel Naomi's gaze on him from the couch, and he knew she was watching him closely. She had been his quiet support through all of this, and now, more than ever, he needed her. He sat next to Marco and watched as his son proudly showed off his creation. For the first time in a long time, Dominic felt a sense of peace. He didn't have all the answers, and he knew the road ahead would be difficult. But he also knew that no matter how far he had fallen into the world of power and fear, his love for Marco and Naomi would always bring him back. The road ahead wasn't clear, but as he looked at Marco's smiling face, Dominic realized he would do whatever it took to protect them both. And that was enough. Dominic walked into the mansion that evening, his mind still heavy with the meeting he had just left. The weight of his choices pressed down on him like a storm he could not escape. He had done what he thought was right, but the business world he had tried to distance himself from was never far behind, calling him back with every decision. His brother's words haunted him. "You can't be weak, Dominic." He had always lived by that principle, but now, after everything that had changed, he wasn't sure if he even recognized the man who had built the empire he led. As he entered the house, the familiar sounds of Marco laughing in the next room brought a wave of relief. That laughter, innocent and pure, was the anchor Dominic needed. He had almost forgotten what it felt like to be part of something that wasn't driven by power, fear, and control. He found Marco sitting on the floor, surrounded by his toys, his face bright with excitement. When he saw Dominic, his eyes lit up. "Papa, look, I made a new track," he said, holding up his toys for Dominic to see. Dominic smiled, the weight on his shoulders lightening just a little. "That's great, Marco. It looks awesome," he said, crouching down beside him. The bond between them, so fragile at first, was now something real, something that Dominic could not ignore. As they played together, Dominic felt an unfamiliar peace. His thoughts, once consumed with business and dominance, now focused on these small moments. He realized that this was what mattered most. Naomi watched from a distance, her heart swelling as she observed the scene. She had always known that Dominic had it in him to be a good father, but now, seeing him so engaged with Marco, she knew that the man she had seen in the beginning, the man who had been lost in his own empire, was slowly coming back to life. She had been patient, offering support without asking for anything in return, but now, seeing Dominic so present, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She knew that he was on the right path. After a while, Dominic stood up, taking a deep breath. "I need to talk to you, Naomi," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Naomi looked up at him, sensing the shift in his tone. She nodded, setting her book aside. "Of course," she said, her voice calm and reassuring. They walked to the side of the room, away from Marco's happy laughter. "I don't know what to do anymore," Dominic said, his voice thick with uncertainty. "I'm pulled in so many directions. Marco, the business, everything. I thought I could do it all, but I'm not sure anymore." Naomi studied him for a moment, understanding the weight of his words. She had seen him struggle with this balance for months, but now she saw a man who was beginning to understand what truly mattered. "Dominic," she said gently, "you don't have to do it all. The business will always be there, but your son won't be small forever. The time you have with him now, this moment, is priceless." Dominic's chest tightened. He had always been so focused on controlling everything that he had forgotten to simply live in the moment. Naomi was right. He didn't have to sacrifice everything for power. He didn't have to choose between being a father and a leader. It was about balance. "I don't want to miss these moments," Dominic admitted, his voice shaky. "I know I've made mistakes, but I want to do better. For Marco. For us." Naomi smiled softly, stepping closer to him. "You're already doing better," she said. "Just being here, right now, that's enough." Dominic looked down at his hands, feeling the weight of his responsibilities, but also a newfound sense of clarity. "I'm not perfect," he said, his voice steady now, "but I'm going to keep trying. For Marco, and for you." Naomi's heart swelled with pride. She had never asked him to change, but in these moments, she saw the man he could become. A man who didn't need to control everything, but who could lead with love and compassion. "I believe in you," Naomi said softly. "And I'm here, always, if you need me." As they stood there, the quiet of the room settled around them. Outside, the world of power and control still loomed, but in that moment, Dominic realized that the true measure of his strength wasn't in his empire, it was in his family. He didn't need to dominate the world. He just needed to be the man his son needed. And with Naomi's unwavering support, he knew that he could be. The next morning, Dominic made a decision. He would step back from the business for a while, just enough to give Marco and Naomi the attention they deserved. He wasn't abandoning his responsibilities, but he was reordering his priorities. The men in his organization would have to understand. Family came first. As Dominic sat down to breakfast with Marco, who was excitedly showing him a new drawing, he felt a sense of calm settle over him. He wasn't lost anymore. He had found something far more valuable than power or money. He had found his purpose. And as Naomi smiled at him from across the room, he knew that the road ahead, though uncertain, was one he would walk with the people who mattered most. The weeks after Dominic's decision to spend more time with his family passed quietly, but the unease still lingered in the back of his mind. Though he had pulled back from the business, the weight of his role as the head of the Castellano family never truly left him. Vincent's words still echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the stakes. "You can't be weak, Dominic." But as the days went on, Dominic found solace in the moments he shared with Marco and Naomi. His relationship with Marco was growing stronger, and each new memory he made with his son reinforced the decision he had made. But even with his newfound focus on family, Dominic knew there would come a time when his past would come knocking. It was inevitable. One evening, as Dominic and Naomi sat together after dinner, a knock came at the door. Dominic's heart sank, and he looked at Naomi, who gave him a reassuring smile. He stood up and walked to the door, expecting to see a familiar face from the business world. When he opened it, he was met not with a business associate, but with a man Dominic hadn't seen in years, Marco's uncle, Louis. Louis was one of the few people Dominic trusted outside his immediate family, but even he knew the business could never be fully escaped. "Dominic," Louis said, his voice cautious. "We need to talk. It's about the organization." Dominic's chest tightened. He had hoped that stepping away from the business would protect his family, but there was no escaping the web he had woven over the years. "Come in," Dominic said, stepping aside to let Louis enter. Louis looked at Naomi, then back at Dominic. "Is Marco around?" he asked. Dominic shook his head. "He's in his room." Naomi gave Dominic a subtle nod, and Dominic led Louis to the study. As they sat down, the silence between them was palpable. Dominic knew what was coming. Louis didn't waste any time. "Things are unraveling, Dominic. The men are restless. There's talk of a new leader, someone who's willing to take the reins if you don't act." Dominic's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond right away. His thoughts raced, but he couldn't let fear dictate his next move. "I've made it clear that I'm focusing on my son," Dominic finally said, his voice steady but filled with a hint of frustration. "But this is my family, and I will not let anyone jeopardize that." Louis's eyes narrowed slightly. "It's not that simple. You've built an empire, Dominic. An empire based on power and fear. And now, they see you as weak. They see you as someone who's distracted." Dominic stood up, pacing the room, feeling the weight of the decisions he had made in recent weeks. His loyalty to Marco and Naomi had made him feel something he hadn't in years, vulnerable. He had pulled away from the things that once defined him, but now the consequences were creeping back. "I'm not weak," Dominic said, turning to face Louis. "I may not rule with an iron fist anymore, but that doesn't make me weak. My son, my family, will always come first." Louis stood up as well, walking over to the window. He stared out for a moment, then spoke, his tone more solemn. "I understand that, Dominic. But you can't forget where you come from. You can't forget what you've built. If you leave the business in disarray, it will crumble. And with it, your family's future." Dominic's heart beat faster, but his resolve hardened. "I'm not letting it crumble," he said firmly. "I will protect them, Louis. But I will do it on my terms, not the terms of men who think they can take what's mine just because I've been more present at home." Louis sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I'm not saying you should abandon your family, Dominic. I'm saying you need to find a way to lead. Because the moment you step back entirely, you risk losing everything, your family, your power, and everything you've worked for." There was a long pause. Dominic stared at Louis, and for the first time, he felt the weight of his decision more than ever. What good was power if it cost him his family? But what good was family if it wasn't protected? He had no answers, only the certainty that he couldn't allow Marco or Naomi to suffer. "I'll take care of it," Dominic said finally, his voice low but resolute. "But I won't sacrifice what's important to me." Louis gave him a curt nod, clearly satisfied with the response, though Dominic knew that the real challenge lay ahead. "I'm here if you need me," Louis said, before turning to leave. As Dominic closed the door behind him, he stood there for a moment, his hand resting on the door handle. The world he had tried to escape from was pulling him back, but now, he had something he had never had before, clarity. His son, his family, were more important than any empire. But he also understood now that he had to find a way to protect both. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but Dominic was no longer the man he used to be. He was a father, and for the first time in his life, he was determined to protect what truly mattered. As he turned to find Naomi, he knew that the road to balance would be long, but with her by his side, he could face whatever came next. The past was still part of him, but it no longer defined him. And as he saw Marco in the hallway, his face lighting up with a smile, Dominic realized that no matter what happened, he had already won the most important battle of all. The weight of Dominic's decisions had never felt heavier. He had spent the last few days in quiet contemplation, balancing his responsibilities as the Mafia boss and as a father. Each day, he tried to make more time for Marco, but the demands of his position were never far behind. When he had made the decision to step back from the business, he hadn't anticipated how difficult it would be to keep the balance. Vincent's words still rang in his ears, urging him to maintain control over his empire, but Dominic knew that things couldn't stay the same. He had to find a way to protect his family without losing everything he had worked so hard to build. One evening, after spending some quiet time with Marco and Naomi, Dominic received an unexpected visitor. It was one of his closest allies, Marco's uncle Louis, who had always been someone Dominic trusted deeply. But tonight, Louis's usual calm demeanor was replaced with concern. "Dominic," Louis said, his voice urgent. "We need to talk. It's about the business. It's spiraling out of control." Dominic's stomach tightened. He had hoped that stepping away would give him some space to focus on Marco, but the world he had left behind was never far. "What's happened?" Dominic asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "The men are getting restless," Louis explained. "They've noticed your absence. People are starting to question your leadership. There's even talk of replacing you, Dominic." Dominic's heart raced. He had worked for years to build his power, but the reality was undeniable. His absence was creating an opening for others to try to take control. "Who's leading these talks?" Dominic asked, his voice low. Louis hesitated for a moment, then spoke carefully. "It's not one person. It's a few of the younger men, the ones who think they can do things differently. They think you've grown soft, Dominic. That you're distracted by your family." Dominic's jaw clenched, and for a moment, he said nothing. The truth hurt, but he couldn't deny it. He had been distracted. His focus had shifted away from the business, and now it was costing him. "I can't just abandon my son," Dominic finally said, his voice tinged with frustration. "I made a promise to him. I'm not going to let anyone take him away from me, especially not for the business." Louis nodded, his expression sympathetic but firm. "I understand, Dominic. But you can't ignore the business either. You built this empire for a reason, to protect your family. And if you don't show strength now, you could lose both." Dominic stood up, his thoughts racing. He had always been able to control every aspect of his life, but now, he felt as if the two things he cared about most, Marco and the business, were slipping away from him. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice strained. Louis met his gaze. "I think you need to reassert yourself. Show them you're still in charge. You can't let this empire fall apart." Dominic felt the familiar pull of his past self, the man who had ruled with an iron fist. But now, something inside him resisted. He had changed, and he didn't want to go back to the man he used to be. "I will handle it," Dominic said, his voice steady now. "But I'm not going back to the way things were. I'll find a new way to lead. I will protect my family, but I will also protect this business." Louis nodded. "That's the Dominic I know. Just don't wait too long. The longer you're absent, the harder it will be to take control again." As Louis left, Dominic stood there, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on him. He had to make a decision, and the road ahead was unclear. But one thing was certain. He couldn't continue to ignore his family or the business. He had to find a way to balance both. The next morning, Dominic woke early. The mansion was quiet, and Marco was still asleep in his room. Naomi was preparing breakfast in the kitchen, and Dominic took a moment to watch her. She had been a steady presence in his life, supporting him when he wasn't sure of himself. He knew he could count on her, but he also knew that the time for decisions had come. He needed to find a way to lead with both strength and compassion. As Dominic walked into the kitchen, Naomi looked up at him. "How are you feeling today?" she asked softly. "I'm doing better," he said, his voice firm. "I've made a decision. I'm going to step back into the business, but I won't sacrifice my family for it." Naomi smiled, her eyes full of understanding. "I know you'll find a way to make it work, Dominic. You always do." Dominic's heart swelled with gratitude. He didn't have all the answers, but he had her support, and that was enough to move forward. "Thank you, Naomi," he said, his voice soft but sincere. Naomi's smile widened. "You don't have to thank me. I'm here for you, for both of you." As Dominic walked to the study, the weight of the decision still heavy on his shoulders, he knew that the road ahead would be challenging. But with Marco and Naomi by his side, he felt stronger than ever. The business would never be easy, but Dominic was ready to take it on his own terms. He wasn't the same man he used to be, and he would never be that man again. He had a family now, and for the first time in his life, he knew what truly mattered. He wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. The days that followed Dominic's decision to re-enter the business were filled with both tension and resolve. The road ahead was unclear, but he knew one thing for sure. His family would always come first. The struggles he had faced over the past months had forced him to rethink everything. He could no longer be the man who hid behind power and fear. He had to be a man who could lead with love and strength. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but with Naomi and Marco by his side, he felt ready to face whatever came next. One evening, as the sun began to set, Dominic found himself standing in the grand study of his mansion, a place that once symbolized his empire. The air was thick with the weight of the decisions he had made. He had spent years building his power, but now it felt like all of it was hanging by a thread. Marco had become his anchor, his reason for moving forward. But the pull of the business was always there, threatening to draw him back in. Naomi walked into the room, sensing the tension in the air. She had seen the change in Dominic over the past few months, the way he had shifted from a man driven by fear and control to one driven by love and responsibility. But she knew that even with the changes, the world he came from was never far behind. "Are you okay?" Naomi asked softly, her voice a gentle reminder that she was there for him. Dominic turned to face her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know," he admitted. "I'm doing my best, Naomi. But I'm torn. I can't just walk away from everything I've built. But I also can't go back to the man I was." Naomi stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "You don't have to be that man anymore," she said. "You've already made the hardest choice. You're here. You're with Marco. And that's what matters." Dominic looked at her, his gaze softening. "I'm trying," he said quietly. "But I still feel like I'm failing somehow." Naomi smiled, her eyes full of understanding. "You're not failing, Dominic. You're learning. And that's the most important thing. You're here, you're present, and you're doing it. For Marco. For us." Dominic took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. He had been so afraid of losing control, of not being able to balance everything. But Naomi was right. He didn't need to control everything. He needed to be there, to show up, to protect the people he loved. The next morning, as Dominic prepared for another meeting with his business associates, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change. He had been in this world for so long, but something inside him was different now. He didn't want to be the feared Mafia boss anymore. He wanted to be a father, a partner, and someone who could still lead without losing himself in the process. As he walked through the halls of the mansion, he passed Marco, who was playing in the living room, surrounded by his toys. Marco looked up and smiled, his face lighting up at the sight of his father. "Papa, look," Marco said, holding up a picture he had drawn. Dominic smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "That's amazing, Marco," he said, kneeling down to get a closer look. "You're so talented." Marco beamed, his eyes sparkling. "I made it for you, Papa," he said excitedly. Dominic's heart swelled with love as he looked at the drawing. This was why he had fought so hard to change, to be present for moments like these. "Thank you, buddy," he said, giving Marco a hug. "I'll keep this forever." As Dominic stood up, he felt a renewed sense of clarity. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew that his love for Marco and Naomi was stronger than any business deal or power struggle. He didn't need to be the strongest or the most feared man in the room. He just needed to be there for his family. Later that day, Dominic sat down with his associates, including Lewis, and laid out a plan for the future. He would still lead, but he would do so with a new perspective. He would delegate more, trust the right people, and most importantly, he would never sacrifice his family again. The men in the room listened carefully, some skeptical, but Dominic's conviction was clear. This was no longer about power or control. It was about legacy and the kind of man he wanted to be remembered as. When the meeting ended, Dominic felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had made his decision, and though the road ahead would not be easy, he was ready. He walked back to the mansion, his thoughts on Marco and Naomi, on the family he had fought so hard to protect. When he entered the house, he found Marco running toward him, arms wide open. "Papa, you're home," Marco said, his voice filled with joy. Dominic knelt down and wrapped his arms around him, holding him tightly. "I'm always going to be here, buddy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Naomi stood in the doorway, watching the two of them. She had always believed in Dominic, but now she saw the man he was becoming. A man who had learned the true meaning of strength, not in the power he held, but in the love he gave. As Dominic looked at her, he realized that this was the legacy he wanted to build. Not an empire of fear, but one of love, loyalty, and family. The past was a part of him, but it would no longer define him. With Naomi and Marco by his side, Dominic was ready to face whatever the future held. Together, they would build a life, one full of hope, love, and redemption. And for the first time, Dominic felt that he was exactly where he needed to be.